I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about why talk about the history of the CIO right now. Like, why is this a pressing issue for the current left? I mean, I agree that it is. That's not a skeptical question, but I do think it needs to be stated before we really get into the substance here.
Sure, yeah. If we're looking for a kind of historical precedent for organizing millions of private sector workers in particular into the labor movement, there's really one time to look to. There's been moments of periodic upsurge in America. Most of those have been fairly fleeting. Thinking in particular of the dramatic growth of the Knights of Labor in 1886. There's a huge uptick in labor activity in around like the turn of the century with the AFL organizing. Then again, during and in the immediate aftermath of World War One, and then there's the sort of 1960s and 70s public sector unionism surge, but that was really a different kind of sector than the CIO was engaged with. The CIO moment, the late 30s, early 40s, this was a time when millions of workers, private sector workers, joined the labor movement, and the key corporations of the time, GM, U.S. Steel, were organized. I mean, before that, the core industries in America, steel, rubber, auto, electrical manufacturing, all these things were unorganized. And very quickly, in the space of a few years, those sectors became almost 100% unionized, and that had knock-on effects for other industries and raising wages and, creating like what we know as the prosperity of the post-war period. It's a little worse today, actually, than it was then. Public sector unionism was not yet legal, and so the 10%. So, in the 1930s, before the Great Depression and the CIO, union density was around 10%, but that was 10% private sector, which is kind of a better situation than we're in now. Today, private sector union density is down to about 6%, I think. We're about to get the latest BLS numbers in a couple days now, and as exciting as 2023 was in terms of labor activity, I wouldn't be surprised if that number is more depressing than we'd like to think it would be. Um, I think there's a lot of similarities there, a lot of differences as well. And in any event, if we're looking for inspiration for the present moment, I think it's the best time to look to.
I think your reason to be skeptical in the numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually pretty sound. The last couple of years, we've seen a lot of uptick in labor actions. We've actually seen a decrease in union density, and that's a reversal of even, say, 10 years ago, where there was a very mild increase of union density, but mostly in public sector workers. Yep. And if we really look at the public sector worker stats, it gets a little bit more concerning, since the largest unions are still the police unions. So it's there are reasons to point out that we're actually in a worse situation than we were in the beginning of the CIO.
Yeah.
For those who are new to the history of labor, though, can we describe? I mean, you mentioned the Knights of Labor in the AFL. People are going to bring up the early IWW too. Can we talk about the CIOs different from the Knights of Labor and the AFL and maybe even the IWW?
Sure. Just quickly about the previous point in terms of differences. I think one other key difference there's a lot of differences, and I think that there would be some historians who would argue that the conditions of the emergence of the CIO are so different than the present moment that it's almost non-applicable as a historical example. So I should just throw that out there as well. I think I disagree with that. Obviously, I think that there are some organizational, political lessons to be drawn from the moment. But to get to, one way in which it was different is just that labor law today tends to channel labor activity in very particular and conscripted ways. So in the 1930s, this was a moment where, thanks to the 1932 Norris LaGuardia Act and then the Wagner Act, and just a sort of general willingness to push the boundaries of what labor was willing to do, there was widespread disruption. And I think that's part of what made possible the CIO moment, that labor activists were willing to push the boundaries of the acceptable. And today, given the very constrained NLRB process, which I think most like labor law experts and labor historians recognize as fairly broken, given that, it tends to channel labor activism into recognition elections, union certification drives, and for good reason. If you can get a contract through those means, it's generally a good thing. It's just that it's become so harrowing a process for so many people that it's almost not worth the effort in a lot of cases. And so it's a different time in terms of just like the way in which labor activism is directed. Um, but to get to your last question, so the American Federation of Labor was the dominant labor federation starting in the late 1880s. In a way, it emerged as a rival to the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor won this huge rail strike. I think it was in 1886. And as a result of that, and as a result of a lot of radicals in their ranks, they grew pretty dramatically. I mean, I think they grew to a membership of almost 1 million people within the space of a year. It was a very dramatic growth. Um, Organizationally, the Knights of Labor couldn't hold it together. So there were a lot of egalitarian impulses within the organization, but at the very top, it was really floundering. I'm forgetting his name, Terrence, the head of the Knights of Labor. I'm forgetting his name now. But in any event, the Knights of Labor had this spectacular rise and then just as spectacular fall. It just didn't hold together organizationally. And the lesson for people like Samuel Gompers and the people who founded the AFL was that you needed some stable business form for unionism. You needed to channel it in a particular form that had leverage and power and sustainability. If you didn't have that, then you'd have these upsurges and then fall away. So with the AFL, they focus particularly on craft workers, people who had particular skills in their industries. They were predominantly a racist and exclusionary organization, sort of by default, right? They focused on what used to be called old stock Americans and organizing them. And so were very anti-immigrant, did not organize Black people, did not organize Chinese people. They were actively hostile to both. And so they formed a labor movement that was almost purposefully self-limiting. Right? They wanted a labor movement that was just for skilled workers, and it was successful for what it was. Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL, liked to talk about pure and simple unionism, right? Like, don't get involved in politics, although the AFL did get involved in politics here and there. Don't raise like broader social justice issues. Focus on industry contracts, craft industry contracts, and take care of your members. That was essentially the model. And it wasn't particularly successful in growing the labor movement, but it was successful in maintaining that staying power. And so from the 1880s, really up until the 1930s, when the CIO broke off, it was growing at times. It was fairly stable. Its members could rely upon it. And I think that that's part of what accounts for the staying power of the AFL, just that it did work for the people who were involved in it. And long past the point when it made sense as something applicable to the economic situation of the United States, people were still defending it to the death, right? They were still defending the jurisdictional claims of different craft unions, despite the fact that they made almost no sense in the new mass production industries, right? The key corporations of America were not organized on a craft basis, right? This idea of itinerant workers going from town to town with particular skills and bringing those skills along and needing to maintain their membership in the craft unions in order to maintain certain standards of living. Well, you with rapid industrialization and these new mass production factories, that didn't really make sense of a lot of people's work situations. And so the AFL model, it was very powerful for the people who were attached to it. But by the 1930s, it had just become clearly outmoded. Just quickly with regard to the IWW, it's an interesting relationship there. I'm surprised that more hasn't been written about the CIO's relationship to the IWW. IWW, sorry. I think that a lot of the key organizers of the CIO were clearly inspired by the IWW. Some had been directly involved with it as well. I think the key difference, though, is this. The IWW was, they privileged the capacity for disruption above other things. And so when the CIO came along, and especially after the Wagner Act, everyone, and that goes from John L. Lewis, the head of the CIO, to communist organizers in Ohio. Everyone agreed that the point of all this disruption was to channel it into stable contracts, to channel it into modern collective bargaining. And that was something that the IWW is not committed to, is not committed to contract sanctity in the same way. And so when the CIO moment rolls around, they say, we do not want to do what the IWW did. Like, okay, sure, we'll allow radicals in here and there, but we don't want to just privilege disruption. We don't want to fight just to fight. We want contracts. And we're in a political moment where that's possible to get them. And so I think that's the key difference, really, between the IWW and the CIO, despite the fact that they drew inspiration from that earlier moment. They largely renounced the goals of disruption and privileging that sort of what you could call more romanticized aspect of working class activism.